A few months ago, I finally got around to watching Frances Ha, easily one of Noah Baumbach's and Greta Gerwig's greatest films. I fell in love with it instantly. It had a very likable but flawed character, realistic performances, a simple story, touched on themes of identity, youth, and loneliness, and was shot in very beautiful black and white cinematography. Both visually and thematically, I was completely captivated by the aesthetics of the film, but couldn't shake the feeling of how similar it was to another film I'd seen a while back, Jan-Ole Goethe's A Coffee in Berlin. Both sharing a similar sense of humor and ways of dealing with themes, A Coffee in Berlin hasn't been seen or discussed nearly as much as it deserves to be. I first discovered this movie back in 2020 while I was quarantining with COVID, and it was the best part out of the whole experience. Something about how simple and real this film felt really stuck with me, and I wanted to discuss how it reflects on the themes of loneliness, youth, and identity, both in its story and direction. A Coffee in Berlin starts with Nico, a man in his mid-20s, trying to sneak out of his girlfriend's apartment. She asks him where he's going and offers him a coffee. He denies the coffee and tells her he won't be back that night. She gets mad at him and they break up, the first of many unfortunate encounters throughout the day. Nico is an interesting character to use to explore these themes because he's sort of the reverse of Frances. He's also confused about his place in this life, but whereas Frances is blindly optimistic about herself, Nico seems dissatisfied with any options on how he can grow up and become his own person. It's revealed later in the film, but Nico uses his father's university payments to fund his own living costs, and dropped out 2 years ago because he didn't know what he was doing and wanted to think about his future, never actually reaching a conclusion. But starting today, this transitional state between childhood and maturity comes to an end, as he comes face to face with characters that could be reflections of his future, just as lonely and confused as he is now. Nico goes home to his new apartment, not even moved in yet, and realized he's late for an appointment with a psychologist after he got his license taken away during a DUI. At the meeting, the psychologist messes around with him, asking him if he's gay and if his parents are still together, before ultimately labeling him mentally unfit to drive. On the way home, Nico stops into an upscale coffee shop and is unable to pay for the high prices. He tries to take more money out of the machine, but it eats his card, and he's caught red-handed trying to take his donation back from a nearby homeless man. At home, his neighbor stops by with a dish full of his wife's meatballs and tries to introduce himself. Although Nico doesn't want to talk and the man clearly just wants someone to vent to, Nico is convinced to let him in by a flask of alcohol. After some brief conversation, the man breaks down, letting Nico know how lonely he is at home and with his wife. Nico awkwardly tries to comfort him, but the man ultimately pulls himself together and returns back to his life without another word. The scene is uncomfortably funny, but it also reflects concerns often had about the future. This man has a home and a wife, but resorts to crying about his problems with strangers because loneliness isn't something he can bear, before returning back to his life defeated. After the man leaves, Nico heads out to a lunch with his friend Matza, an actor, where they both meet Julika, an old classmate of Nico that used to have a crush on him. Nico doesn't remember Julika, but she tells him that she was bullied for being fat by others at school to the point where she attempted suicide and was sent to a boarding school. As she leaves, she invites the two of them to an experimental dance performance she is a part of later that night. In this scene, Nico also again tries to order a coffee, only to be told that the coffee machine is out of order. Besides being a funny gag that runs throughout the film, I do think there is some simple but effective meaning given to that coffee. As Nico tries to grasp for some sense of direction in his life, he can never seem to really get it or be satisfied with it. It also helps that it implies Nico has issues with alcohol, having been given a DUI and turning to drink 3 times throughout the day given the opportunity. But as he tries to make something better for himself, as he tries to calm down and focus, instead of what he wants, he gets offered beer, schnapps, and vodka. Leaving the restaurant, Nico and Matza head to a film set to watch one of Matza's friends act in a film about a Nazi officer who falls in love with a Jewish woman. After Nico fails to get coffee from an empty dispenser, and as Matza talks to a producer about a possible small appearance in the film, his actor friend gives us the insight that, like Nico, Matza is also stuck in trying to have a life that he can be satisfied with. We're told that when they were in acting school together, Matza had many offers for roles but turned them all down as they weren't what he wanted. Eventually, time ran out for Matza and the offers stopped, forcing him to resort to acting in television adverts, never really given the chance to perform the perfect part. Later on, Nico is given a call from his father and the two agree to meet up and discuss his bank issue. The two meet at a golf course, and as Nico tries to order a coffee, his father erases his order and instead tells him to drink schnapps instead. This moment fits in well with my previous interpretation of what the coffee means, as this is the moment that Nico's father tells him he knows he's dropped out of university and is being cut off. His father berates him, asking him what he did with his money for these last 2 years, and Nico sits in silence, not saying anything other than he just thought about life. Chances are that he realized he didn't like what he was studying and didn't enjoy this version of the future, so feeling overwhelmed, he just quit until he could find an answer. But that answer never came. Nico also clearly comes from a family that is well off, giving him the opportunity to even be able to just sit around and think about life without studying or working to support himself. But now that that support has been cut off, the day that he has to choose who he'll be has arrived. His father tells him to get new shoes and a job like everyone else before leaving, cutting off contact for good. On the way home, Nico is stopped by 2 ticket inspectors who are finding him driving without a ticket, despite the ticket machine being broken at the previous station. The scene is mostly played for laughs, but does go along with the psychologist as how Nico experiences figures of authority. Both of them seem uninterested in actually listening to him, with the doctor making fun of him and the ticket takers refusing to let him go for a genuine reason. Later that evening, Nico and Matza meet up to go to Yulika's show, making a brief stop at a young drug dealer's place so Nico can enjoy a brief moment of simple peace as he tests out an old woman's reclining chair. Matza and Nico then arrive later to Yulika's show, an interpretive dance piece that includes her miming the act of eating herself before throwing up. After a brief argument with the director, Nico and Yulika step out for cigarettes where 3 men harass her. After some brief back and forth, Nico is punched in the nose and the two step into the bathroom so she can heal him. She tells Nico that after being bullied for so long, she became confident and refuses to accept harassment from anyone. The two then begin to have sex, but when she asks Nico to call her fat, he becomes uncomfortable and stops. Thinking that he thought she was still too fat to be attractive to him, she becomes furious and throws him out. Although Yulika also seemed like she was happy and comfortable in her life, and although she was able to change being overweight and bullied to being fit and confident, these incidents in her past deeply manifested themselves within her, leading the thoughts of being fat and worthless to being in her sexual fantasies and artistic performances. Defeated, Nico turns to a bar on the street where he asks again for coffee, only for the machine to already have been cleaned for the night. He orders a vodka and a beer and is suddenly joined by a drunk old patron. Nico asks to be left alone, but not understanding him, the old man continues with his speech. He talks about not understanding a word that the people around him are saying, and how everything in the city has changed. He goes on to mention that as a young kid he used to play in these very streets, and he was taught to salute Hitler. One night he witnessed his father participate in Kristallnacht, a night in which the Nazi party, aided by civilians, methodically destroyed the businesses and synagogues of Jewish citizens. And as he walked around a city torn apart by hate, he began to cry because the glass on the road meant he couldn't ride his bike anymore. This old man is another foreshadowing for Nico, and unlike his neighbor, is one that has already reached the end of his life, still to find out that he has none of the answers to the questions that Nico is asking himself. The lines that he looks around and can't understand anybody and doesn't recognize anything mimics the feeling Nico needs answered. Even the memory of Kristallnacht, besides evoking the feeling that life has moved too fast for this man to make sense of it despite that being 90 years ago, marks the same moment Nico is in right now, although at different points in each other's lives. In the way that Nico has run out of time to sit around and try to make sense of life and find comfort in it, the man as a young boy is being confronted with the horrors of the world before being able to understand it, with the only thing he can think of after a night of targeted violent attacks being that he can no longer play. As the man says goodbye, he collapses outside of the bar, and after Nico accompanies him to the hospital, he passes away in the morning. He's later informed by the nurse the man had no family and his name was Friedrich. After a day of breakups, being cut off, ruining relationships, and end-of-life reflections, Nico is finally able to stop into a diner for a cup of coffee. The film utilizes an unconventional method of storytelling, namely being that the main character doesn't go through any changes in the film. Instead of an emotional arc, which has to come to some conclusion, we get a mosaic of different characters and chapters in one man's day, each reflecting some part of coming to terms with the life you have without necessarily understanding all of it. After discovering this movie, it immediately became my go-to comfort film, and I really hope I was able to introduce this to someone who needs it in their life like I have. Definitely check this and Frances Ha out if you haven't. They're all well worth it, and let me know what you thought of them down below. That's all from me for now. Peace.